In November of 1912, Padre Pio wrote a letter to his spiritual director, Padre Agostino Daniele, that has been preserved in the canonical archives since his death. He was describing what the enemy had spent weeks attempting: not violence, not fire, not the dramatic physical assaults that fill the more sensational chapters of his biography. What Satan was attempting, Padre Pio wrote, was something quieter and more dangerous. He was attempting to cut the channel, the connection between Padre Pio and his spiritual director, the line of communication, of accountability, of guidance. Satan employed, and I am working from the Epistolario, Volume 1, the authenticated archival text, what Padre Pio described as deafening noises and disorienting physical attacks, specifically designed not to injure him, but to break his mental clarity, to make coherent thought impossible, to sever the link between the soul and the anchor that was keeping it stable. That was the weapon. Manufactured noise, manufactured confusion, manufactured urgency that crowded out the space in which a human being could hear anything quiet. I need you to hold that image for a moment, because I want to tell you something that changed the way I look at almost everything I own. That tactic, the one Padre Pio documented in November of 1912, is now automated. It does not require a demon working in real time. It has been engineered into the architecture of every device in your home. It runs on servers, it scales without limit, and it accomplishes in 47 seconds what took the enemy hours of physical assault in Padre Pio's cell. My name is Raymond. I taught Catholic theology for 35 years at a high school in Covington, Kentucky. I attended a conference by Father Chad Ripperger in 2018 and walked out of the auditorium a different person. I have spent the years since reading Padre Pio's actual letters, not the devotional summaries, the actual letters, and cross-referencing them against Ripperger's clinical and theological work. What I found is the convergence I am going to describe to you tonight. I'm not asking you to throw your phone in the river. I'm asking you to understand, with theological precision, what it is actually doing to your soul. Let me start with the letter. November 5th, 1912, Epistolario, Volume 1. Padre Pio writes to Padre Agostino about the enemy's primary strategy in the sustained assault he had been enduring for over 2 years. He identifies the target, not his body, not his health, not his vocation, his ability to communicate with his spiritual director. Satan's first move was not violence. Satan's first move was communication sabotage. And if you read across the letters of 1910 through 1912, which I have done carefully with the Italian original alongside the English translation, you find that Padre Pio identified in those letters 4 specific targets that the enemy consistently attacked. The first was attention. The enemy's assault was designed above everything else to make sustained, directed thought impossible. Padre Pio could not hold a train of reflection without an interruption. Noise, physical sensation, the sudden intrusion of a violent or blasphemous image at the exact moment of recollection. The second was perception and discernment. What Padre Pio called the enemy transforming himself into an angel of light. The ability to make evil look like good, confusion look like clarity, the enemy's voice look like God's voice. The assault on the capacity to correctly read one's own interior state. The third was the communication channel to his spiritual director. This was not incidental. Padre Pio writes, in a letter from the same period, that the enemy explicitly urged him, in the interior locutions he experienced, to keep his spiritual battles secret. As our secret, the voice said. The isolation strategy. If the enemy can sever the soul from accountability, the attack operates without resistance. There is no one to name what is happening. The person is alone with the distortion. The fourth was manufactured urgency. The creation of a constant interior state of alarm, of pressure, of the sense that something required immediate attention, that there was no time for quiet, that stillness was dangerous. Padre Pio described this state in terms of a kind of frantic interior noise that made reflection feel impossible, and made the normal remedies of prayer and silence feel not like relief, but like additional strain. 4 targets, documented in his own hand in authenticated letters from 1912. I want you to write those 4 down. Attention, perception, the communication channel to spiritual accountability, manufactured urgency. Because what I'm about to describe is not a metaphor. In 2004, the average human attention span, measured by Gloria Mark at the University of California, Irvine, in longitudinal studies that have become foundational in the field of human-computer interaction, was approximately 2.5 minutes. By 2023, the same research methodology produced a figure of 47 seconds. 2.5 minutes to 47 seconds in less than 20 years. I want to be precise about what that means spiritually. A soul that cannot sustain attention for 90 seconds cannot pray a single Hail Mary without interruption. Not without effort, without interruption. Padre Pio spent hours in contemplative prayer, not because he was spiritually heroic in some superhuman sense, though he was that, but because the ability to hold attention in the presence of God is the basic architecture of an interior life. It is what prayer is built on. Remove it, and you have not removed prayer from the schedule. You have made the faculty that prayer requires physiologically uncomfortable. The enemy does not need to make you stop going to Mass. He needs you to arrive at Mass with an attention architecture so degraded that you cannot receive what the Mass is offering. He needs you spiritually present in body, absent in soul. And the 47-second attention span accomplishes that without the enemy lifting a finger. Now I need to introduce you to someone who probably did not think of himself as describing demonic warfare. His name is Aza Raskin. He is the man who designed the infinite scroll. You know the feature, the feed that never ends. The page that refreshes automatically as you reach the bottom so that there is no natural stopping point, no moment when the content simply runs out and you are left alone with the decision to stop. The infinite scroll eliminated the pause, the fraction of a second in which a person would have looked at the bottom of the page and thought, "This is where I stop." Raskin has since spoken publicly and at length about the consequences of what he built. He now campaigns actively against the mechanisms he helped design. He has stated, in recorded interviews and conference presentations, that the infinite scroll was engineered on the same psychological principle as a slot machine, the variable reward loop. B.F. Skinner demonstrated in the 1950s that the most addictive pattern of reinforcement is not consistent reward. It is unpredictable reward. The rat presses the lever and sometimes gets a pellet and sometimes does not. And the unpredictability produces a compulsive, escalating pattern of lever pressing that consistent reward never generates. The variable reward loop is the operating principle of every major social media feed. Each scroll might produce something interesting, or it might not. The uncertainty is the mechanism, and what it produces in the brain, in the psychology, in the attention architecture of the person holding the phone is compulsive, effortless, completely automatic continuation. You do not decide to keep scrolling. You simply have not decided to stop. And there is a difference between those two states that matters enormously from a spiritual standpoint. Dr. Chad Ripperger, whom you have heard me cite before, but whose relevance here is specific and I need you to see it, has taught extensively on what Thomas Aquinas called the sensitive appetite. This is not a peripheral concept in Thomistic anthropology. It is central to the map of the human person that the Church has always used. The sensitive appetite is the faculty that governs what the body craves: pleasure, stimulation, novelty, reward. It operates below the rational will. It is the layer of the person that wants before the person decides whether to want. And it is, Ripperger teaches consistently, the primary attack surface for demonic manipulation. Not the intellect, not the will directly. The sensitive appetite, because it responds before reason engages, because you can convince a person of something through the sensitive appetite that you could never convince them of through argument. Silicon Valley engineers discovered the sensitive appetite without calling it that. Every behavioral psychology principle embedded in the architecture of modern social media is a technical description of sensitive appetite manipulation. The craving for novelty, the reward-seeking pattern, the compulsive return to a stimulus that rarely fully satisfies but produces enough unpredictable reward to keep the behavior running. When Ripperger describes the enemy's preferred attack vector, and when Aza Raskin describes the psychological mechanism he weaponized, They are describing the same faculty. One of them knows it, one of them does not. There is a second witness I want to bring in here. Tristan Harris. Harris was a design ethicist at Google. He left Google and has spent the last several years testifying before Congress, speaking at conferences, and building an organization called the Center for Humane Technology. His explicit thesis, his own words, documented in interviews in his testimony, in the film The Social Dilemma, is that the platforms were designed to hijack the mind. Hijack, not influence, not engage. Hijack. He means that the design architecture bypasses the rational will, the faculty, by which a person makes deliberate choices, and hooks directly into the reward circuitry that operates beneath deliberate choice. A secular design ethicist and a Thomistic exorcist, working from completely different frameworks using different vocabularies, arrived at the same diagnosis. What Ripperger calls the sensitive appetite, Harris calls the brain's reward circuitry. What Ripperger calls demonic manipulation of the sensitive appetite, Harris calls a product designed to hijack the mind. When two independent frameworks arrive at the same description of a mechanism, something real is being described, and Padre Pio named it in 1912. The manufactured urgency, the noise that prevents reflection, the interruption of the channel between the soul and its anchor, the attack on perception and discernment. He was describing an interior experience of what we now know as an exterior architecture. I want to tell you about a student I had. His name was Marcus. He was a junior in 2012. My last decade in the classroom, the decade when the phones arrived. Not the decade when we noticed the problem. The decade when the phones arrived. Marcus was not a weak student. He was one of the brightest young men I taught in 35 years. He had read Thomas Aquinas. He could explain the structure of the natural law argument from memory. He had a genuine interior life, or the architecture of one, that most of his classmates did not. And Marcus could not sit through a 15-minute adoration without trembling. That is not a dramatic description. It is a physical observation. He would sit in the chapel during our Thursday afternoon periods of Eucharistic adoration, and within 5 minutes, his hand would move to his jacket pocket where his phone was. He would catch it. He would bring his hand back. 3 minutes later, the hand would move again. Not because Marcus wanted to check his phone more than he wanted to be in the presence of Christ, but because he had been conditioned. His sensitive appetite had been trained, by years of variable reward exposure, to experience silence as deficiency, to interpret the absence of stimulation as a kind of suffering. The stillness of the chapel felt to his nervous system like deprivation, like something was wrong. He told me this afterward, quietly, one afternoon in my classroom. He said, "I don't know why it feels like that. I know it shouldn't. But when it's quiet, it feels like I'm missing something important. And I can't make that feeling stop." I did not have adequate language for what Marcus was describing at the time. I do now. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 2733, identifies acedia, spiritual sloth, as the most serious temptation against prayer. Augustine wrote, "Our heart is restless until it rests in you." The screens are the industrialization of that restlessness. They are not simply distracting Marcus from prayer. They have engineered at the level of his sensitive appetite an inability to experience the precondition of prayer: silence, stillness, the capacity to be alone with God without the compulsion to be elsewhere. The enemy does not need to tempt Marcus away from prayer. He needs Marcus to arrive at the chapel door with a nervous system so conditioned to stimulation that silence itself feels like an attack. And by 2012, the phones had done that work. Now I want to return to the November 18th letter, 1912, same Epistolario, Volume 1. In this letter, Padre Pio describes a second element of the enemy's strategy that I have not yet addressed. The enemy, speaking in the interior locutions, the whispered suggestions that Padre Pio had learned to identify and document, urged him to keep his spiritual battle secret from Padre Agostino. "As our secret," the voice said. The word "our" is the tell. The enemy was proposing a partnership, a shared secret, something between Padre Pio and the enemy that would exclude the spiritual director. because the spiritual director was the one person who could name what was happening. In the economy of spiritual warfare, this is not incidental. It is structural. Ripperger teaches, and the tradition across centuries of exorcism practice confirms, that one of the first and most consistent signs of diabolical obsession is the interior pressure to stay silent about it. The compulsion not to tell anyone. The sense that sharing the interior experience would be shameful, would be misunderstood, would make things worse. The isolation impulse. Modern Catholics statistically have no systematic spiritual director. What fills the vacuum? The phone fills the vacuum. When a person experiences interior distress, anxiety, dread, the hollow ache of something not right, the conditioned response now is to reach for the device. Not for counsel, not for accountability, not for someone who can name what is happening and tell them what to do. For stimulation. For the variable reward loop that produces enough momentary relief to suppress the impulse to address what is actually wrong. The enemy's isolation strategy, keep the battle a secret, sever the channel to the anchor, now has a delivery mechanism that the person picks up voluntarily 400 times per day. I want to be honest with you about where I stand. I am not technophobic. I made this video on a computer. The argument I am making tonight is not that screens are intrinsically evil. Padre Pio used the telegraph. The mechanism of communication is not the problem. The problem is what the architecture of modern screens is specifically engineered to do. And what it does. The infinite scroll, the push notification, the algorithmic feed, the variable reward loop, is target precisely the four things that the enemy targeted in Padre Pio's cell in 1912. Attention, perception, the communication channel to spiritual accountability. Manufactured urgency, all four, simultaneously, at scale, and we hand the device to our children at age 9 and call it education. Now here is where it gets uncomfortable. Because the solution is not technological. The solution is not a parental control app. It is not a screen time limit set by the phone's operating system. These things are not useless, but they address the symptom, not the mechanism. The mechanism is interior. What the screens have done to the sensitive appetite, the conditioning of craving, the engineering of restlessness, does not disappear because you put the phone in a drawer for an hour. The correction has to work on the same faculty that the damage targeted, and that faculty is restored the same way Padre Pio's was. Not through willpower alone, through a spiritual architecture that makes the silence tolerable and eventually, over time, desirable. The word Padre Pio used for this architecture was direction, a spiritual director, a confessor, an anchor, a person, not an algorithm, who knows your interior state, who asks the questions no variable reward loop will ever ask, who can name what is happening when the person living inside it cannot see it clearly. I want to give you something practical to begin with tonight. 3 steps. I am calling this the screen exorcism protocol, not because it is dramatic, because that is precisely what it is. The first step is the audit. Tonight, 15 minutes. Open your phone and find the screen time report. Most phones generate this automatically. Look at the total hours per day averaged over the last week. Write that number on a piece of paper. Then ask yourself a second question. In the last 30 days, how many consecutive days did you pray for 20 or more uninterrupted minutes? Write that number next to the first one. Put them side by side and look at them. This is your spiritual attention budget, made visible. I'm not asking you to feel guilty, I'm asking you to see. The soul has a limited supply of sustained attention. Whatever fills the attention architecture is taking something. Every hour that the sensitive appetite is being trained towards stimulation and novelty is an hour in which it is being trained away from stillness. The numbers on that paper are not a moral judgment. They are a diagnostic. The second step is the boundary prayer. Tomorrow morning, before the first screen, I want you to do something that will feel small and will not feel small. Before you touch the phone tomorrow morning, before the news, before the messages, before the reflex reach that most of us make within 90 seconds of waking, pray this aloud. Out loud, not in your head. Lord, I offer you my attention before I offer it to anything else. St. Pio of Pietrelcina, who fought the enemy's assault on your mind every single day, intercede for me. Let no algorithm, no notification, no engineered urgency steal the first moments of my day from you. Then wait 20 minutes. 20 minutes of silence or of scripture or of prayer before any screen contact. I know that feels like a significant ask in the context of how most mornings work. I'm aware of that. But I want you to notice what happens in those 20 minutes, not what you miss on the phone. What happens in your interior life. Because the first few days will be uncomfortable, genuinely uncomfortable, in a way that should tell you something about the degree of conditioning that has accumulated. The discomfort is the diagnosis. The third step is the communication channel restoration. This is the most important of the three. Identify one spiritual anchor, one person, a confessor, a priest, a serious Catholic, not a casual acquaintance, but someone with a genuine interior life, someone who prays, someone who is not afraid to say a hard thing to you if a hard thing needs to be said. Make contact this week. You do not need to have a specific problem to discuss. You do not need to present a case file. You need to open a channel. Padre Pio survived the enemy's assault. Years of it, relentless, coordinated. Because Padre Agostino was on the other end of a channel. Because there was one person who knew what was happening and could name it and could guide the response. The enemy's first move is always isolation. It was in 1912 and it is now. Restore one accountability channel, one person who knows the real state of your interior life. If you have a confessor you see regularly, make your next confession more honest than the last one. Tell them something you have not told them before. If you do not have a confessor, make that the first task of this week. Find one. Ask your pastor. Contact your diocese. Do not wait until you have an obvious problem to solve. The channel needs to be open before the crisis, not after. That is what Padre Pio's survival taught. I want to close with something that is not a warning. I have spent this evening explaining a mechanism of attack. I want to end with what Padre Pio, who lived inside that mechanism for years, actually concluded. He concluded that the attack was evidence of the enemy's desperation, not his power, his desperation. The soul that is worth attacking, Padre Pio wrote, is the soul that is moving towards something the enemy wants to prevent. The organized, sustained architectural assault, the one that mobilizes noise and urgency and manufactured confusion and isolation, is aimed at souls that have something worth taking. The 47-second attention span, the compulsive scroll, the engineered restlessness that makes the chapel feel like suffering. These are not signs that the enemy is winning. They are signs that he is afraid of what would happen if the souls carrying them ever learned to be still. I'm not asking you to throw your phone in the river. I'm asking you to see it for what it is, and to choose your attention with the same intentionality Padre Pio chose his. Take this with you tonight. God bless you and stay vigilant.